In this lecture, I'm going to give a brief introduction to the Linux operating system and discuss some of its features, some distributions of Linux, and why Linux is a valuable tool for us in terms of learning about operating systems. Now, what is Linux? Well, generically, the term Linux refers to a class of operating systems that use a common kernel. Now, distributions of Linux, or operating environments as they're sometimes called, are cobbled together by taking the Linux kernel and adding various different user space tools to it. Many of these core tools originated in the GNU project, which originally started at MIT, and thus systems are sometimes called GNU/Linux instead of just Linux. I typically, however, say just Linux when referring to either the kernel itself or to the operating system distributions that are based upon that kernel. The Linux kernel was originally started as a hobby by an undergraduate at the University of Helsinki, a gentleman by the name of Linus Torvalds. He still heads the kernel development project. Now, Linux is what's called a monolithic kernel, and that means that the device drivers are built into the kernel. However, it's not a true monolithic kernel because the device drivers can be built as modules and loaded and unloaded from the kernel at runtime. The latest stable version was 2.6.37 on January 5th of 2011. That has since been updated to version 3.03, I believe, was the latest version that I've seen as of now, which is late August 2011. The latest version can also be checked by going to www.kernel.org. Here is an example of some of the main components of a Linux operating system. At the lowest layer, we have the computer hardware. And on top of that hardware, we have the Linux kernel. The Linux kernel contains a number of built-in subsystems that enable access to the computer hardware. These include drivers, memory management, process management, file systems, networking, including sockets and protocols, and other utilities that the kernel provides. On top of the kernel, we have the GNU C library, upon which most other libraries are based, since C is typically the lowest level system language to which all other software is eventually compiled. On top of that, we have our compiler, GCC, some important utilities called core utils, also part of the GNU project, and the born-again shell, or bash, which provides a command line interface into the system. All we need in order to run a Linux system and do useful things with it is everything below this line where I'm moving the mouse right here. All the software above this line is add-on software that's not strictly needed in order to run a Linux system, but makes Linux systems more convenient or do other things. So for example, we can add network tools such as Secure Shell Server and a generic services server called inetd that can launch all kinds of different services. We can also run a LAMP stack, that stands for Linux, Apache, MySQL, and PHP. If we're in a desktop scenario, we can also run a graphic user interface. This includes X11, specifically the x.org distribution, and one of a number of different environments that can be run inside X11. Popular ones include GNOME, KDE, and XFCE, which isn't on this particular graphic. Now, a large number of people have come up with different distributions of Linux. These distributions contain different sets of software, but they all share the Linux kernel in common. We typically classify distributions by which package manager they use. Unlike Windows and Mac systems, where we install individual applications and then have to manually update each application by running separate installers, Linux distributions typically use package managers, which download and install extra software and update existing software with a single command. These package managers include the Red Hat Package Manager, or RPM, which is used in Red Hat Enterprise Linux, Fedora, Mandriva, OpenSUSE, and a number of other distributions. A competing package format is the Advanced Package Tool. This is used primarily by Debian and derivatives of Debian, such as Ubuntu. There are other binary formats, however, in use. Slackware uses a TGZ format with its own package management commands. Arch Linux has a custom written package manager called Pacman, and there are some others out there. There are also source formats. Gen 2 is able to build everything from source using eBuilds. Linux from scratch isn't so much a distribution as it is a book that tells you how to put together your own Linux system by compiling sources for each particular application. This is, of course, time-consuming. And there are other source formats out there as well. Now, in industry, Red Hat Enterprise Linux is quite popular. It's a Linux distribution from Red Hat Incorporated, which is based in Research Triangle Park, North Carolina. That's in the Durham area. It is an open source distribution, but the official product is sold with an update subscription accessed via per installation serial numbers. Therefore, in order to get the update subscription and the installation media, it's necessary to purchase the subscription from Red Hat. They do use the RPM package format. In fact, they invented it. RPM stands for Red Hat Package Format. CentOS is a free rebuild of Red Hat Enterprise Linux that's widely used in academia, industry, on many high-performance computing systems, and for many other applications. This, of course, uses the RPM package format and is available at zero cost. Fedora Core is a community distribution that's sponsored by Red Hat that grew out of an old product that Red Hat used to produce, which was called Red Hat Linux without the enterprise part. And Fedora is used to develop and test packages and infrastructure that are later incorporated into the enterprise Linux product. Debian is a fully open source distribution which avoids proprietary software and has an emphasis on security and stability. The stable version of Debian is extremely stable because the packages are extremely well tested. The flip side is that those packages tend to be rather dated, and thus an unstable version is available if more bleeding edge packages are needed. Debian uses something called the Advanced Package Tool, or apt, in order to manage its software. Ubuntu is actually based on Debian. It's sponsored by a company called Canonical Limited, which is based in South Africa. It's designed to be easy to use and friendly to new users switching from competing platforms. There's a new release every 6 months, and it's often necessary to completely reinstall the operating system at each new release. There is a functionality that's built into the Advanced Packaging Tool called Dist Upgrade, which seems like a great idea on paper, but in practice often doesn't work right and leaves the system unstable. Ubuntu also has a package pinning policy. Thus, once a package is released, it's only updated for security updates. If new features are added, one has to wait till the next version of Ubuntu comes out before getting the newly updated package. Now, Arch Linux, which is what I personally run, is a minimalist framework for creating a custom system. It's not so much as a distribution as it is a set of tools that enables each individual to create his or her own installation, customized to his or her own desires. It's a different philosophy from traditional distributions. It is a completely written from scratch distribution. It's not based on any other, and it is what's called a rolling distribution. There are not discrete versions of Arch Linux. Every time you run a system update on Arch Linux, you get the latest version of the operating system, along with the latest version of all application packages, and all the latest bugs. And the Pacman Package Manager which was written from scratch for Arch Linux, is used to manage the software. So these are just a few examples of different Linux systems, different Linux distributions that can be used with the highly scalable Linux kernel.